Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we remind each other that philosophy has always been about the public good and that we've got to do our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. I'm joined today by a friend of mine, a scholar of significant note, and also a scholar of breadth in ways I can't even describe. Please welcome Katy Attanasi. We went to Vanderbilt University together. I was over in philosophy. She was in religious studies, ended up getting her PhD from Vanderbilt, and works primarily on American religious experience and religious traditions, and has done quite a bit of work on evangelicalism and Pentecostalism in particular. Katy, thank you so much for being with me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks also for doing all of these videos on philosophy. It's really great to have accessible resources out there, and as soon as my kids get a little bit older, they're going to be watching and writing summaries. So
Well,
thank you for doing this.
I appreciate that. And maybe we can start off by tell us a little bit about sort of how you got into the field that you work in, how it is that you developed these interests and started doing this research. Maybe you started there at Vanderbilt and has moved forward.
Sure. Well, I've just recently started a research project on evangelical Pentecostal Christians and politics. And as you know, that's kind of a hot topic. But my interest in it actually, I grew up in Pentecostalism. I grew up in the Assemblies of God. And my dissertation research was on HIV/AIDS in Africa, in South Africa. And that actually really does shape how I look at the issues that we face today. I finished my dissertation in 2009. I studied Black South African Pentecostal women's responses to HIV/AIDS. And I spent several months in country interviewing women and pastors and other stakeholders. And what I found was that within these extremely conservative South African Christian communities, there was not 100% agreement on how churches should talk about HIV prevention, and there was definitely not 100% adherence to the church's messages. So even in places where there's a lot of pressure to conform to a particular set of behaviors or a particular set of theological beliefs, not everyone complies with those mandates, and not everyone makes a big deal out of it. Everyone just kind of does their thing. Selah Ben-Abid talks in the Claims of Cultures about how cultures don't speak with one voice. So when we look at evangelicalism today, especially when we look at white evangelicalism, it sometimes looks like a homogenous group. And it seems like everyone is Republican and everyone is pro-Trump. But that's not exactly the case. The statistic that we see most frequently is that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016. So my question has become, what about the 18%? Who are they? What have they always had this political identity? What led them to make that break with the Republican Party?
What have you found as maybe reasons underlying some of this break with Trump or break with some, more standard or majoritarian views in relationship to white evangelicalism?
Well, as I said, so these are faithful members of Christian communities, and they either quietly or loudly, it just depends on their personality and their perspective and their location. They either voted Democrat or they just chose not to vote for Trump. Most of them struggled with this vote. It wasn't an easy decision, and not all of them are even comfortable about talking about who they voted for, how they voted with their faith community or with their family members. And I think that this is due to the immense social pressure that evangelicals experience to conform to that Republican identity. It's not surprising that we don't hear a lot about these voters, but they are there. And so what I'm trying to do is lift up examples of this alternate political identity. What I've found is that all of my participants, and for the most part, have grown up in this evangelical Pentecostal subculture where to be Christian is to be Republican, and you can't be Christian without being Republican. So several of my participants talked about growing up listening to Rush Limbaugh, and to the extent that it was available, they watched Fox News. So it's been a pretty big deal for them to break with the political part of their identity. But almost all of the situations, there was some sort of encounter or experience that made them reconsider equating faith with the Republican Party. Several of my participants lived overseas. Others moved to different countries, either as adults or as children. And some just simply moved out of their community of origin and became friends with individuals who really challenged them to question their assumptions and to think differently about the world. I also found that there were a few that adopted kids who had special needs, either internationally or from the foster care system, and they found themselves needing to access the services that they had previously thought that the government shouldn't be providing. So this personal experience of being on the receiving end of friendship, of government services, disrupted their assumptions about God being on the side of Republicans. So it's been really interesting to see how, what has led to the break with their community, even as they still participate in community.
Whenever I tell people that I was raised evangelical, though I now no longer identify that way, I do still identify as a Pentecostal. When I tell people that, look, I'm a Pentecostal who is on the far left politically, I get lots of raised eyebrows, lots of suspicion. When I came out, as it were, as a Bernie supporter during the campaign this year, I got a lot of pushback from pastors in particular, but also just lots of my Republican, more conservative evangelical friends. And they were utterly shocked because for them, abortion was the single most important voting issue. That my supporting someone on the left seems to them to be tantamount to my supporting, infanticide. How is it you've seen that single issue either solidify a kind of homogeneous conception within the Republican stranglehold on evangelicals, or have you seen people beginning to be more nuanced and think through abortion as one among many different types of issues that evangelicals can care greatly about?
I think that's a great question, because for many of people of faith, that pro-life stance is the main reason that they won't break with the Republican Party. They feel compelled to vote for candidates who say that they are pro-life, even if they don't demonstrate good moral character, and even if they've had inconsistency in their anti-abortion stances. So the people that I talked with who broke with Trump or the Republican Party are still very much pro-life and they're anti-abortion, but they tend to have made one of two shifts, or maybe both shifts, with regard to that stance. For some, they're coming to understand, and I think that there's some really great scholarship out there by Randall Balmer in particular, historical scholarship that shows that abortion has not always been this polarizing political issue. And it's really fascinating because Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973. And when you look at what Southern Baptist leaders were saying about abortion, up until the 70s, the mid to late 70s, Southern Baptists would have supported Roe v. Wade. They supported abortion because they supported the belief that life begins at birth. And now, of course, they believe that life begins at conception. So there's this fraught history that has to do with political organizing, with racism, with segregation, and it ends up being that the moral majority, the religious right, begins to take its shape with abortion as the central issue. But understanding that history really does help put the issue in context. Another way that these evangelicals or Pentecostals are conceptualizing their commitment to pro-life issues is they identify themselves as being pro-life from womb to tomb. So what they mean by this is that they are committed to life and flourishing in terms of supporting pregnant women, in terms of supporting refugees. They oppose the death penalty, and they see this ethic as being consistent and as being a more faithful rendering of what it means to be pro-life. So it extends that emphasis on life to people beyond unborn babies, and it applies to people at all stages of life.
Why is it the case, do you think, that it's just so hard to talk about this when at some level this is just talking about history and talking about sociology, even before it's talking about theology and conceptions of how we understand an anthropology grounded in particular conceptions of the Bible? Why is it so hard to talk about this stuff?
I think that politics and Christianity has kind of taken in many ways the easy route and wanted to say, this is right and that's wrong. And we take really complicated issues and distill them into talking points and into these moral binaries that say right, wrong, good, evil. And on the one hand, it's really easy to live your life that way because there's insiders and outsiders, there's good and bad, and it's a reliable way to engage the world in the sense that you always have an answer. Are you in, out, good, bad? And we don't have to do the heavy lifting to figure out what's going on with a particular issue and what the implications are. And we definitely don't have to, with that kind of binary perspective, we don't have to allow for nuance, and we don't have to sit with the anxiety and the tension of saying, this is really complicated and I don't think I have the answer to this right now.
One of the things that has been fascinating to me in watching your work develop is that in many ways you've shifted from speaking only to an academic audience to trying to actually be a voice within these communities, inviting them to think more constructively about where they are and how they engage with each other. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your recent experience reading some books with people holding different views and different backgrounds and different social stances. How is it that they've been able to think more constructively and move forward in maybe productive ways that overcome that binary logic that you're suggesting is such a detriment to thriving social existence?
I think that there are some really good tools out there for thinking through, how do we move past this tendency to think that there's just two sides to every issue, that there's a Republican and a Democrat side to a political issue. And one of the most helpful resources that I've found is a podcast called Pantsuit Politics. And the producers of that podcast have a book that's called I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening. I'm just going to hold it up here, even though it's a mirror image. So I think you're wrong, but I'm listening. And it's by Stewart, Holland, and Beth Silvers. And it's a guide to grace-filled political conversation. So earlier this year, even though it feels like 2 years ago, earlier this year, we had a group at our church. We call them growth groups, and we got together and we talked about the different the chapters in the books, and we just kind of worked through those questions of what does it mean to be politically engaged in a polarized context, and how do we love our neighbor when we completely disagree with them. And it's been a really helpful resource because what I think it does is it helps us to move past talking points and into real policy issues. One of the earlier chapters is called Take Off Your Jersey. And the basic argument is that politics has become kind of a team sport. And we don't want, like I said, we don't want to do the heavy lifting. We just want to go onto our favorite news source, whether it's Fox News or CNN or MSN, and find out, if an issue comes up, if an immigrant, say, for example, immigration, if there's an immigration story, well, what do I think of this? Well, we go to our website to get the information instead of really thinking it through for ourselves. So the challenge in that moment is to take off your jersey and do some really hard research and think it through and think about what the values are that that I bring to the conversation. What do I value? Do I value federalism? Do I value states' rights? Do I value a government that provides for a safety net? All of those questions are important ones that we bring to the political conversation, and it makes for a more interesting and a more complicated conversation.
The vast majority of folks are reasonable and moral and seeking truth the best that they can. It's just that in many ways, they've not been invited to do so in conversation with others with whom they disagree. How is it that you've been able to create those spaces and navigate that really difficult work of inviting them to see a we where formerly they've been trained only to see the other who should be rejected? How do we create that solidarity where competition currently reigns?
As I sit here thinking about, who's going to watch this, I think about the community that nurtured me. We went to one church for my entire childhood through being a teenager, and the church that I was dedicated in as a baby is the church I got married in. And I mean, these are the people who raised me, who now look at pictures of my daughter on Facebook and say, she looks just like you, Katy. You know, I think about them listening to this, and I wonder if they will think that I'm one of them now, the other side. And I think that for me, I don't, I don't want to be identified in part of those us versus them conversations. I want to believe that, if we really take seriously this notion um, that my undergraduate school liked to proclaim, that all truth is God's truth, then we can approach the world with a greater openness. And if we really believe that the same God who attended our church services this morning, this is a Sunday, and we had online church, and the same God who's with us today is the God of history and the God of tomorrow, then if we can have that historical perspective, then it's almost like maybe we could breathe just a little bit more deeply and say, okay, we're going to be okay. This is hard, but God's presence doesn't come with an expiration date or with a conditional, you have to make these political changes or I'm out of here. I mean, that's not how God works. And so, I'd like to think that we can have these conversations, and that that for you and for me, that the people who nurtured us and gave us life in our early religious faith are the same people that we can still have conversations with. Is that easy sometimes? Absolutely not. That is not easy. And I think that there is a lot of suspicion on both sides, and there's a lot of hurt on both sides. Something that I think is really a powerful truth from Brené Brown in Braving the Wilderness is that it's hard to hate people up close. And I think that that's something that changes people's minds. When I look into the eyes of someone who I know and who holds a position that's different than mine, I can have that conversation. So I did my master's work at Harvard Divinity School. And when I told everybody that I was going, there were a lot of people in my faith community who said the things like, be careful, don't lose your faith. And then there's always a story about some friend of a friend or relative who had gone to Harvard and lost their faith. To me, I very much, in a sense, found my faith at Harvard and at Vanderbilt in a sense of I found ways that I could think about the world that resonated with me and that made it possible to keep my faith and to rebuild it in a stronger way, because some of the things that I had always believed were not working for me by the time I hit my early 20s. But there is a suspicion about bringing in this expert knowledge or outside knowledge.
So, Katy, it's interesting to hear your account of how hard it is to be within these communities that have raised you and worry that they may see you as having abandoned the core of that identity and your anchor point, as it were, for your own story. And yet, one of the things I've struggled with is my friends on the left often see me as compromising my moral commitments and my political stances by continuing to try to find ways to remain in conversation and in deliberative engagement with white evangelicals who do, for example, continue to support Trump. That has been in many ways the harder set of objections because it strikes at the center of my own moral stances on these issues that I wish evangelicals will reconsider. How is it that you have experienced maybe those objections coming from both sides rather than it somehow just being easy to stand on one side or the other?
I think that what's presumed in, by the people who would be critical of ongoing conversation with evangelical Pentecostal communities is a very dangerous and harmful assumption and hurtful assumption that it shows up in various ways that treat Pentecostal and evangelical Republicans as they're ignorant and backwards and uneducated. And those kinds of labels and that kind of treatment is not going to lead to any kind of conversation or discussion that's fruitful. similarly, the kind of assumptions that there's, that those liberal professors at X university, there's got to be a starting point, and those are not good ones, the ones that have, those kinds of assumptions. And I think that's where, the work by Brené Brown is really helpful, because it says you have to lean in, and you can't, it's hard to hate people close up. It's hard to hate your neighbor who brings you groceries because you can't go out. And, just taking a breath and taking a pause and realizing, people are complicated and there's always a story.
So given that this is such hard work and it's hard to live into this space, it's not just hard scholarship, it's hard existence. What do you see as maybe moments of hope and optimism? From where I stand, 81% supporting Trump remains a cause of frustration. Where is it that you're seeing cause for optimism, that maybe real evangelical critique of evangelical failure might be possible in these communities?
I think that understanding that a lot of these perspectives are grounded in historical trajectories. I think that they're grounded in a lot of fear, and fear of religious persecution, and fear of being pushed out of a particular place of power, fear of losing influence. I just finished reading a really great book that kind of outlines this historical argument by John Fea. It's called Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. And he really kind of traces this perspective from the Puritans, even, of the sense of being called and the sense of being persecuted. And I think that we see those two tensions very clearly in evangelical and Pentecostalism today. So I think that the promise and the optimism comes from a posture that says, I'm not going to be afraid. Like, we don't need to be afraid of difference. We don't need to be afraid of ideas that are new, that are perceived as threatening, that we have the resources to think through hard ideas and hard issues. I think the Methodists have done very well to gift us with the Wesleyan quadrilateral: tradition, reason, experience, and scripture. We don't just have one of those. We don't just go to scripture and our pastor's reading of scripture. We have our own experience, and we have this rich historical tradition. And like we've talked about, within this tradition, there's been lots of disagreement. When we read history, sometimes we just see the winning arguments. But if you really study and understand that, you can acknowledge the hard work of contestation that people are doing to form the positions that ultimately carried the day. And the same thing when we look at the Bible. Peter and Paul were not great friends. They did not agree on things. And I mean, they were in conflict, and that's preserved in the canon. And I'm really grateful for that. The same thing, in Deuteronomy, if you follow the law, God's going to bless you. And in Job, if you follow the law, sorry, Job, you did follow the law. Thank God that both of those books are in the canon, because they're disagreeing and they're giving us two different perspectives, and they're both preserved as inspired scripture. So when we take this historical and biblical view that Christians have always disagreed, and when we can bring in these tools of reason and experience, then these disagreements can become an opportunity to learn and to refine our viewpoints, and we don't have to be threatened by it. It becomes okay to disagree. When, if you want to draw on the Peter and Paul language, when, someone opposes you to your face and says you're wrong about this, it becomes an opportunity to self-examine, and to think, and to also discern and discuss and figure out, what can we do to further human flourishing? How can we do that best as individuals and as the church?
I think that's such a good answer. And it actually is a way, I think, of thinking about optimism, not just as they will eventually become part of us, but an optimism that understands that the root of the democratic project itself is this plural conception of who we are. And so I love that we started with evangelical traditions not being homogeneous, not being just a monolith of a particular Republican identity, but in fact saw how that was a historical product. And it's not necessarily something that is problematic or bad, but it is something that we've got to attend to and take seriously in order to recognize the horizons toward which we can continue to strive in solidarity despite disagreement. Thank you again, Katy, so much for your work, for your example, for your standing in the gap, as we would say in the churches, between this binary logic, between these two communities that often want nothing to do with each other. You are inviting both of them to engage each other as we all continue to understand the truth of what it means to be in this existence together. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And to everyone, thank you as always for watching, for tuning in on Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we remind each other that philosophy has always been about the public good, and we've got to do our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. We'll see you next time.